What's up, everyone? My name's Horizon, and today I'm going to be checking out the current world record run of Cuphead. So this is a game I beat a couple months ago, but it was very difficult and took me a while to do, so I thought it would be fun to check out a optimized way of running through it and comparing their strategies to the the bare minimum ones I was able to pull together. So this is done by SBDWolf. I will have their channel linked down below. Please show them support because speedrunning of any kind is an insane amount of dedication and very difficult to pull off. So the amount of skill and dedication that people put into this cannot be understated. But without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. So I'm going to assume that they're taking out every boss, doing minimal side stages to collect coins and stuff, maybe just for certain power-ups and stuff. But I know the bosses and collecting the souls is how you progress from island to island and eventually access the devil fight at the very end. So I'm very curious about what weapon choices are going to be used to optimize the boss fights. If there's any certain special movement power-ups they end up using to optimize being able to move while still doing damage and avoiding certain fights. But yeah, so it makes sense that they're doing this is the first traditional platform stage, because in Cuphead there's really only two types of stages. One's like this that have coins that you can collect, that have pretty standard enemies, hazards, things like that you have to avoid, and then areas where it's just a boss fight. So it's kind of cool because the boss fights are pretty difficult and are going to take multiple attempts to learn down, or to learn and nail down. So the fact that you can just jump right in is very, very good. So yeah, they knocked out the level in 33 seconds. And obviously they're not going to be worrying about level grade or anything like that, so I'm sure there are speedrun categories that do focus on trying to get A's or S's on all the levels, but this is an any percent, which the goal of that is to just finish the end of the game at any rate. It can be glitched, however, but I'm assuming with this there aren't really any major glitches you can pull off, but looks like this is going to be the first boss fight that they take on, which this boss is very, very easy. I don't think I even died to this one once. It's just a couple different vegetables that you fight in a garden. All of them have one, maybe two attacks that they do that are very telegraphed, very easy to avoid. So there's the onion. I think a carrot is next. Yeah, and then the carrot is the last one. You might not even really see many of the attacks with how fast they're doing damage. I think the weapon choice they're using is interesting. It's kind of a boomerang shot. So you shoot it, it goes not very far ahead of you and then comes back. It's not one I used in any of my playthroughs. I caught a couple people using it when I was watching streams and different boss guides and stuff, but it's not one that I found necessary to use, but it seems to be an optimized way to at least take out some of the levels. But okay, so this is another boss fight. This one was pretty difficult for me. I think I died a couple times because this one has a couple different mechanics that require some pretty precise jump timing. And I'm very impressed by the damage boosts that they're using through this. So for those of you that aren't as familiar with speedruns, damage boosts are intentional damage that's taken by the speedrunner to optimize clearing a certain area or fight or something. So when you see a speedrunner get hit, it's almost always intentional. So sometimes it's to avoid a certain enemy that would take longer to actually kill traditionally. So it makes more sense to just run into it, take the hit, and then keep going. So for boss fights, it seems like that there are certain attacks that are going to be just kind of face tanked, more or less, because it makes more sense to sit there and keep firing away rather than trying to avoid and then get back to doing damage. And then I think this is the second boss I fought. This one's pretty straightforward. It's just it hopping around. I think the second phase, it gets a little bigger. But yeah, okay, so it pretty much does the same thing. It might not... Okay, yeah. Okay, so there is actually another phase that ends up happening where it turns into like a tombstone and kind of slides back and forth and smashes down, but I guess if you kill it fast enough, you don't deal with it. So that's really interesting that certain phases only happen if the fight lasts a certain length. So I'm curious to see if other boss encounters end up doing the same thing. And this is a good introduction too, that so there are, I mentioned the two different levels where it's the traditional platforming levels and then boss fights, but with the boss fights there is the land fights where you're just actual Cuphead moving around individually, but then there are these aerial plane fights which are really, really fun, but I feel like I found them overall to be more challenging. And it might just be because since you have the full range of motion, that there's more directions that things can hit you, and the developers took advantage of that. Because there's some fights that'll happen later on that you'll see little things pop up from out of the corner or popping out from the top or something that are very, very small, but they're banking on you trying to focus on the boss and what's coming at you from the right, that you're not always going to register what's coming up from like the top left. But this fight was pretty straightforward. I don't think I struggled much with it. There's going to be... Is there another phase? No, I guess not. So I thought it was this fight. It might be another one where it turns into like a crescent moon. And does a bunch of different attacks, but that might just be one that ends up getting skipped with this too, since it got progressed through so quickly. But I could see them not really trying to do any more of the traditional platform levels. The only reason I could see them doing that is if they need more currency to buy other upgrades. This boss fight is pretty straightforward too. I know it took me a couple tries to get it down, but the key is the three platforms that are there. There's certain attacks that'll go above it, some that'll go below, and then certain projectiles that will get caught on the platforms that it helps to kind of stay under them. But that's the whole, I guess, gimmick of this fight. But most of these fights, I can already tell that you're not really going to get to see the key core mechanic with it, because the fights are going to end so quickly. Like, as you see, that one lasted all of 25 seconds. And then I believe that's the end of Island 1. So yeah, there's these little dice houses here that you have to present the soul contracts that you get from the bosses to King Dice here. And if you don't have all of them, he doesn't let you pass. So the actual boss levels are mandatory, whereas, as I mentioned before, the platform levels are not. So this one, I could see they're just going to blast through. I know you're not going to see all of the mechanics in this fight because there's so many different enemies that can run out. Here, there are two phases where she ends up popping up at the top of the castle. But it looks like they're using that gumball attack right at the beginning of the door frame there to just kind of maximize damage on whatever comes out the second it comes out. And yeah, they're absolutely taking advantage of every level you start out with 3 health and boss fight's already done. Because there is a phase that was missed, that the Andy Castle there starts crawling forward, so you have to deal with the movement of it coming towards you. But yeah, it looks like they're taking full advantage of the 3 health that you start every level with, and using that as 2 damage boosts to get through certain mechanics to end the fight as fast as possible. So here is another aerial fight. So this one is, from what I remember, one of the more simplistic aerial fights. I think that later on, if the phase even happens, that there's one that, if you use this one is, if you're not as familiar with like bullet hell type games, which are a specific type of like aerial shooter, phases like that will be kind of hard to maneuver. But yeah, this is a phase. Oh, and yeah, it cleared out. I found it easier to switch to the secondary fire, which is kind of a bomb that lobs out that does more damage, but it's less accurate than just the standard kind of bullet fire. But yeah, it's so funny that they found ways to get through these fights so fast that the majority of the fight doesn't actually get to happen. Which is interesting. I didn't expect there to be a way to bypass certain mechanics. I thought it would be hard cutoffs of like phase 1 going into phase 2 and so on, with like each phase having its own set of health delegated to it. But it seems like there's just one base health pool with the boss, and if you can do enough damage while the transition's trying to happen, that the subsequent phase ends up just not happening at all. So this fight is definitely a struggle. I would say it's the biggest test so far of aerial maneuverability, because you do need to try and avoid these pinwheels, but also do damage to the pillars fast enough to where you can actually get through without taking damage. So I personally found the first phase of this fight to be the most difficult, because there's a couple attacks that basically just kind of randomly shoot out projectiles. So if I was able to get through that, then the rest of it was most of the time manageable, unless I got fairly bad luck with that kind of pillar pinwheel phase. But yeah, wrapped up that fight in 50 seconds. So I think that this whole time I'm just going to be blown away by how fast they knock out each boss fight. This is a boss that I really struggled with. So this one, I don't know if they'll even make it to the last phase, but this phase was pretty straightforward. You just avoid that. The ducks above can damage you if you don't shoot them and make them spin. But that's all you really have to worry about in this one. You will see the main annoying mechanic that occurs for the rest of the fight. So there is this roller coaster cart that goes through that. The front cart does damage, the people do damage, and the back does damage to you. So while trying to do damage and avoiding the balloons that happen, wow, so this actually skipped 2 phases. That's so insane. Wow. But yeah, there's a point where the roller coaster speeds up, and you have to get used to the rhythm of that, because you can basically jump down and then you only have enough time to jump back up. But wow, so yeah, with that fight, they skipped 2 phases. So let's see what boss they're going to go to next. Is this the dragon? Okay, so this is a boss that actually a couple people I know, they stopped the game at this point because this boss gave them so much trouble, which, if we end up seeing the last phase, you'll kind of see why. This phase is tricky. This whole fight's tricky because of you needing to be aware of where all of the clouds are, but also his tail sometimes shoots up from the bottom, which only happened once because we're already in phase 2. And phase 2 is done. It's phase 2 already. Is the fight done? The fight is done. Okay, so no phase 3. So when the tongue rolls out there, what normally happens is little flames start marching out, and certain ones, it's random. Sometimes it's every 4th one, sometimes it's every 3rd one. It really varies. Will jump out and lunge at you. So you are trying to do consistent damage to the boss while also being aware of where those flames are going to sporadically jump. And then there's a whole 3rd phase that I won't even cover because we didn't get to see it. And then, okay, so that's Island 2 done. So they're speeding right along here. And it looks like the speedrun's already over halfway done. because it lists the current world record time as 23:18, which this one beats that by 2 seconds. So we're already halfway done. This boss fight was very difficult because if you'll get to see, there's a lot happening from all directions. The honey is constantly raising, so you have to constantly move platforms. See, there's random spikes that shoot out there. The honey does damage to you if you get to touch it, and then the queen bee actually will pop out from random directions. And if you bump into her, she does damage. And then there's those little bullets that go up in certain patterns that, luckily, it's predictable, so if you're aware of them enough, they are pretty easy to avoid, but it's also really easy to get lost in with everything that's happening on screen. So, boss fight wrapped up in 30 seconds. Most of these fights, if you do fight them traditionally, don't last a crazy amount of time. That's maybe 2 or 3 minutes on average. There might be a handful of ones that last a little longer than that, but it's not marathon boss fights, which, if any of you have played Dark Souls or games of that nature where boss fights can last upwards of 10 minutes, nothing like that in this game. This is what I would consider, based on what people have told me, to be one of the hardest fights in the game. Because there's so much happening. This fight, wow, it's already done. So, wow, okay. So there's a whole other phase where, like, the robot falls apart and then the crazy doctor comes back and is, like, floating in his head, and it's how I mentioned before with the bullet hell and the bird, where it's, like, all of the feathers flying out in a bunch of directions. That last fight, the last phase of that fight, is just that happening constantly while there's floating electric pillars that you have to move up and down. But wow, I am pretty speechless with how fast that boss fight got wrapped up. This fight's pretty straightforward, nothing really to, like, it's based around a play, so you'll see kind of, like, it's a cool concept to watch. But I honestly don't remember much of this fight because I think I beat it in 1 or 2 tries. A lot of these fights are trial and error, and the only way you can learn them is by dying to a new phase. So that can be a frustrating style of learning for people if they're not familiar with it. But it's an old school approach to games, I think, because games like Sonic and stuff, that you die a lot in that, but the point is to learn certain stages well enough to where you can get through it without dying to where you can die to the new areas, and then you eventually learn those well enough to where you can progress, and you just kind of keep starting over and over and over. And that's basically how these boss fights are, is you're probably going to die to the first phase, but then you'll get it down well enough to where you can start dying to the stuff you don't know in the second phase, and so on and so forth until you actually get it done. This fight, if we get to see it, is pretty cool because there's a handful of phases where, like, you'll see there's a cat eye that's popping through there. Eventually, if you are able to get through the phases with a rat here, you actually have to fight the cat, and there's a whole mechanic with that. Those bottle caps that came out, not going to see how those work. So it looks like you do actually have to fight the cat based on just the progression of the fight. Oh, I forgot that it's a robot. Hidden lore. Yeah, so that fight's already done. Barely got to see any of it. It's so insane how fast they're blowing through these. Like, I'm gonna keep saying it, but I'm genuinely shocked by it because for me and other people that have played through this game traditionally and more casually, the fact that they're blowing through so many phases of these fights is insane. And yeah, this fight, there isn't anything too crazy. It's just, yeah, you're on this dock. There's a variety of projectiles and stuff. The fight's probably going to end here any second now, before anything major happens. But yeah, it's one of the more straightforward fights. There's maybe 5 or 6 different attacks that you just need to that you need to learn what it looks like when the attack's about to happen so you can position yourself appropriately to dodge. but one of the more straightforward boss fights in the game, so nothing terribly crazy there that's being missed. And one of the things I do like about this game, because it is by default a very difficult game, is all of the boss fights do come with a simple difficulty, which removes some of the mechanics. I think it cuts out maybe a phase or two, to make it so if you want to just kind of progress through the game, you can do that. You can't fight the last boss if you fight all of them on simple mode. This boss, I'm going to stop there for a second. This boss is one that I struggled a lot with. I don't think we'll get to see the last mechanic or the last phase, but there is a mechanic that comes out later with this fight where she starts petrifying you and turning you to stone. And you have to work to break out really quick because there's so many things moving on the screen. And okay, so we didn't see phase 2 at all. So yeah, this is phase 3. This is the final phase. That green wave is what petrifies you. So you need to avoid what she spits out, along with the spikes, like in the cave there, along with there's these little floating barriers that also pop up, but there was only one that showed up there because the phase ended in like 3 seconds. It's legitimately insane. But okay. So, okay, so they're doing a train here, and then I think this is the last fight of this island. This, I think there's 4 phases in this. I would be very surprised if we see all of them, but also, like, it's all different entities, like, they're all different ghosts, basically, like, it's a haunted train. So, like, here, it's gonna be a giant skeleton. Next, it's 2 eel-looking monsters, and then the end is like a haunted train that's like raised super high and is running. Yeah, I don't know what those are. So it looks like we will, just because this looks like it's a fight where each, since it's split up and you're fighting basically 4 mini bosses in a row. But this fight is significantly harder than they're making it look. This is actually when because I was playing this game on stream, this is a boss fight that actually made me end one of my streams early because I got so frustrated with it. And then I came back refreshed and was able to knock it out in a couple tries, but that is one of the more genuinely frustrating fights in the game. That they knocked out all 4 phases in under a minute. So let's see here. So I think there's only 2 boss fights left. I think they're going to enter basically the game's version of Hell now, which, yeah, Inkwell Hell. So there's only 2 bosses in this area. King Dice, which is the one you've been giving the soul contracts to, and then you have to beat him. You don't have a simple difficulty with that. Once you beat him, then you unlock the devil fight. This one's interesting because this one they'll actually have to go through all of it, because I think that's, I'm going to say it's roulette, I don't know, dice, whatever, but a little board, you basically have to make it all the way to the end to actually get to fight the King Dice himself. Because up until then, you have to fight, I think there's 9 different mini-bosses that you can possibly fight. And there is a way, so I'll try and point it out here when it happens, but there's a die that you have to, like, jump and hit, and it lands anywhere between 1 and 3, and that's how many spaces you move. You'll see that little blue arrow there. And there is a way that you can time it out to predict what you're going to land on. It's a little weird, so I'm not going to describe how, but there is a way to do that, so you can pick what fights you want to do, which is what I'm assuming they're doing here. They're doing the fights that is easiest for them to just blast right through. And I'm very curious to see how they end up taking out King Dice himself, because the mini bosses for me were pretty straightforward. He's not doing the ones that I really tried to do, or that I found the easiest. But I struggled a lot with the actual King Dice fight at the end. And there are safe spots on there to where if you land on them, you don't actually get anything. And there are certain boss fights to where if you land on it and you beat it, you get an extra health. So there are some perks and some strategy along with that. This, I think, is the last mini boss I ended up learning. Wow, okay, so barely got to see any of that. But yeah, it's basically a card matching game that you have to knock out, and also while killing the boss. So, yep, just landed. And it's tricky too because the space right before actually fighting the boss is a start over, so it can possibly send you all the way to the beginning and you have to possibly fight the bosses again. And okay, so basically just kind of damage boosted a little and obliterated the boss. So that was the longest fight we've seen so far, a whopping minute 29. I think that one took me 3 or 4 minutes to actually clear. And then we are actually already at the last boss, which this one I would expect to see all of the phases. Because the first one is you're actually fighting like the full devil body himself. There's a handful of mechanics and stuff. I'm sure we won't see all of them. But basically the phase starts out with him on his throne, basically throwing some random attacks here and there. But at a certain point, you actually jump down into like a fire kind of area. And it's just a giant floating head and some different mechanics. Wow, okay, already in phase 2. So that one's tricky because a skeleton, when he jumps out, since it's a transition, I didn't expect it to hurt me on the first one, but it absolutely does if you're standing there. So we might not actually see the last phase. There's 5 platforms. As you gradually do damage, the 2 exterior ones drop out to where there ends up only being 1 left. And yeah, so killed the boss before the last 2 even dropped. So yeah, that was a lot of information to pack in, but I'm not surprised. I was kind of expecting that because of how fast they were progressing through. But yeah, 23-16 flat. That was incredibly fast. We barely got to see... I don't think we got to see the full phase of really any boss fights. Well, there was a couple, maybe 2 or 3, where you were literally fighting multiple different entities, so the fight had to progress that way. But if it wasn't that case, then the bosses, we missed 1 to 2 phases as a whole. So wow. I didn't learn how to do anything with that, but I'm not surprised by that, because it all happened so fast, and to really optimize a game like this takes so much effort and research and stuff that trying to analyze a fraction of what they're doing in the 23 minutes that it's happening is pretty much impossible. But yeah, like I said, I'm gonna leave a link to their channel down below. Please show them support, because like I said, pulling off something like this takes hundreds, if not thousands of hours of preparation to do. Incredibly impressive. Speedrunners do not get enough appreciation for what they do. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do with this reaction series, because I know that a lot of people don't understand what's happening with speedruns a lot of the time, so I like to use the kind of base knowledge I have to explain some of what's happening. But if you enjoyed my analysis of everything, feel free to give the video a like and toss the channel a subscribe, because this is going to be something I do regularly with games I've played through. And if you watched up until this point, thank you so much. I appreciate you. Again, my name's Horizon, and I will see you in the next one.